The gift of the harmonists arrived in our star system. Their ships were not made of metal. They looked like spun light and frozen music. They moved without sound. They moved without effort. They simply appeared. They hung in the void above our worlds. They were silent messages of a power we could not comprehend. We were terrified. We were also filled with a desperate hope. Their first message was not a threat. It was an offer, a promise of peace and perfection. They called themselves the Harmonists. They said they had watched us for a long time. They saw our wars. They saw our pain and our endless cycles of sorrow. They saw the ghosts we carried in our hearts. They wanted to cure us of our own history. They broadcast images into our minds, visions of a future without grief, a universe where every action was logical, where every being was in perfect accord. No more arguments over scarce resources. No more tears shed for loved ones lost. They offered us the great quiet, a state of being free from the burdens of memory. We looked at our scarred planets. We remembered our fallen ancestors. The offer was incredibly tempting. We sent our ambassadors to meet them. The beings we met were flawless. Their forms shifted like calm water. Their voices were a chord of pure harmony. They explained their gift with patience. They would touch our minds. They would gently lift away the weight of our past. We would become like them, serene, logical, and eternal. They promised us it would not hurt. They promised it was the only true path to happiness. They called our memories a sickness, a chaotic plague that caused all conflict. They showed us how our emotions led to flawed decisions, how our love led to jealousy, how our courage led to needless sacrifice. They made a compelling case. For a moment, we almost believed them. We almost reached out and accepted their gift. The universe held its breath. Then we learned the price of their perfection. Their cure was not a gentle healing. It was a complete erasure. They would not just take away our pain. They would take away everything. Every cherished memory of a childhood friend, every lesson learned from a foolish mistake, the joy of a first love, the pride of a great achievement. All of it would be gone. They showed us the process. A wave of psychic energy would wash over us. It would smooth the rough edges of our minds. It would file down the peaks of our joy. It would fill in the valleys of our sorrow. We would be left perfectly flat. We would be blank slates, perfectly logical, perfectly empty. They could not understand our horror. To them, this was a beautiful thing. We saw a simulation of one of our own after the cure. The person was calm. The person was efficient. The person felt nothing. They did not recognize their own family. They did not remember their own name. There was no spark in their eyes. Just a placid, sterile emptiness. The great quiet was not peace. It was the silence of a tomb. We realized they were not offering a gift. They were offering an extinction of the soul. This was the true face of the harmonists. They were not healers. They were cosmic janitors. They saw the beautiful, chaotic mess of our existence, and they wanted to sweep it all away. They considered it their sacred duty, a duty to bring their clean, silent order to the cosmos, one screaming, vibrant species at a time. We gave them our answer. It was a defiant roar that echoed from every colony, from every ship and every station. We refused their great quiet. We chose our messy, painful, glorious existence. We would rather live with our ghosts than become ghosts ourselves. The harmonists received our refusal. They did not understand it. They registered it as a final symptom of our disease. So they decided to begin the treatment by force. Their first attack was not on our bodies. It was not on our cities. It was on our minds. A psychic wave rolled out from their fleet. It was a wave of pure, concentrated logic. It was designed to overwhelm our chaotic thoughts, to silence the noise of our emotions, to flatten our spirits before the physical war even began. It was the weapon that had pacified 1,000 other worlds. We felt it coming, a pressure building in the space between our thoughts, a cold, sterile hum that promised emptiness. It sought to find our fears and amplify them. It sought our anger and tried to soothe it into apathy. It sought our love and tried to prove it was a chemical flaw. It was an attack on the very concept of being human. They thought it would be a simple, clean victory. But the harmonists had made a terrible miscalculation. They assumed our minds were like theirs, ordered, structured, and fragile. They had no idea what they were about to encounter. They were a perfectly tuned orchestra. They were about to meet a hurricane of heavy metal, blues, and chaotic jazz. They expected a house of cards. They found a mountain range forged from memory. Their perfect psychic wave met our beautifully imperfect minds. And it shattered. Our history became an unbreakable shield. The wave of logic slammed into a wall of shared grief. It was the memory of every soldier lost in every pointless war. The sorrow was so vast, so deep, it absorbed their attack. Their logic had no answer for a mother's cry. Their wave tried to impose order. It ran headfirst into the illogical hope of 1,000 religions. It crashed against the stubborn faith of forgotten prophets. It was baffled by the joyful noise of a child's birthday party. How could they quantify such things? How could their sterile energy fight the memory of a perfect joke? It was like trying to catch a river in a net. The harmonists' wave reeled back, confused. It was designed to calm and pacify. Instead, it met our collective rage. The burning fury of every injustice we had ever suffered, the anger of the oppressed, the righteous fire of those who fought for freedom. Our rage was not a flaw. It was a furnace. It burned so hot that their cold logic simply evaporated. They did not understand. Their star science had predicted our easy collapse. Our minds were supposed to be weak, filled with contradictions and irrational fears. They were right. Our minds were filled with those things. But those were not weaknesses. Our sorrow was our armor. Our anger was our sword. Our illogical hope was our shield. And our memories, our entire, messy, beautiful history, was a fortress they could never breach. The psychic assault failed, so the harmonists brought physical war upon us. Their ships of light began to move. They flowed through space with a terrifying grace. Our own fleets looked clumsy in comparison. They were brutalist blocks of metal and fire, held together by grit and desperate prayers. We knew the odds were against us. We just didn't know how badly. The flawless first onslaught began. Their weapons were not explosions. They were precise cuts of energy. They sliced through our hulls with surgical precision. They targeted our engines and life support. They were not trying to destroy us. They were trying to disable us, to make us helpless for the next wave of their mental cure. It was a cold, efficient, and horrifying strategy. Our fleets burned against their perfect logic. Our commanders used every strategy in our books. Feints, flanking maneuvers, concentrated fire. The harmonists countered every move instantly. Their network of minds acted as one. They predicted our tactics before we even committed to them. It was like playing chess against a machine that could see every possible future. We were losing ships at a terrible rate. We fired everything we had. Missiles streaked across the void. Plasma cannons roared their defiance. The Harmonists' ships simply flowed around the attacks. Their forms warped and shifted. Our weapons found only empty space. It was a dance of death. And we were the partner who kept stumbling. Our courage was great, but their perfection was absolute. Our first defensive line shattered in mere hours. We watched our best ships die. We saw the lights of entire squadrons wink out. It was a massacre guided by flawless algorithms. There was no rage in their attack, no passion, just the cold, relentless application of force. This was how they brought peace to the universe. They pruned the unruly branches of the star-born tree, and we were the next branch to be cut. Hope began to dwindle. The battle was a foregone conclusion. Their logic was simply superior. But then, something shifted. Deep within the command centers, our historians and strategists were working. They were not looking at star charts. They were looking at our own bloody past. They were looking for a different kind of answer, an answer that was not written in the language of star science. We began to study our own brutal history. We looked back at the wars that had scarred our home world. We analyzed the tactics of ancient warlords, men and women who fought with swords and spears. They had no computers. They had only their cunning and their desperation. Their battles were not logical. They were messy, chaotic, and unpredictable. They were perfectly human. We found forgotten strategies, tactics based on deception and what our ancestors called gut feelings. We found stories of hopeless last stands, of clever traps laid by outnumbered forces. These were not the clean, predictable strategies of modern warfare. They were born from a time of mud and blood and fear. The Harmonists could predict our computer simulations, but they could not predict the ghost of a long-dead general. One of our admirals, a woman named Eva Rostova, found a particular tactic. It came from a sea battle fought 2,000 years ago. An outnumbered fleet had used fog to hide its movements. It tricked a larger force into breaking formation. We had no fog in space, but we had nebula clouds. We had sensor ghosts and electronic warfare. It was a wildly illogical plan. It was a desperate gamble. We used tactics they could not predict. Admiral Rostova took a third of her fleet into a dense nebula. It was a graveyard of ships, a navigational nightmare. The Harmonists' logic told them it was a pointless retreat. But it was a trap. Rostova was not running. She was channeling the spirit of that ancient sea captain. She was using the chaos of space as her fog. The Harmonists followed, expecting an easy kill. Inside the nebula, our ships went quiet. We turned off our main sensors. We navigated by sight and by memory, like the sailors of old. The Harmonists, with their perfect network, were suddenly blind. Their logic was based on clear data. In the swirling dust and radiation, their data was corrupted. Their perfect unity began to fray. They were a single mind. And we had just thrown static into their thoughts. That was when we found the flaw in their network. Their collective consciousness was their greatest strength. It was also their greatest weakness. They shared every thought, every sensation. They experienced the universe as a single, harmonious chord. But what happens when you introduce a dissonant note? What happens when you blast a symphony with pure, chaotic noise? We found our new weapon. It was not a missile or a laser. It was our art. It was our music. We reconfigured our communication arrays. We began to broadcast everything we had, every piece of chaotic, emotional, human expression we had ever created. We sent them the raging guitars of ancient rock anthems, the mournful cry of a lonely saxophone, the defiant poetry of revolutionaries. We fought back with our art and music. We flooded their perfect silent network with our noise. We sent them paintings of swirling, impossible colors. We sent them films with illogical plots and emotional twists. We broadcast the sound of a baby laughing. We broadcast the sound of a stadium roaring for its team. We sent them 100,000 different love songs, all singing about the same beautiful, illogical feeling. The effect was immediate and devastating. Their flawless formations wavered. Their ships of light seemed to flicker. They were a single mind, and we had just given it a migraine. The Harmonist Collective had never encountered such a thing. They could process data on weapon yields and shield frequencies. But they had no algorithm for heartbreak. No defense against the pure, chaotic joy of a symphony's final crescendo. Their unity fractured. Individual ships began to move erratically. The single, harmonious chord of their consciousness was shattered into a million screaming notes. They were experiencing centuries of our art in a single moment. The sorrow, the joy, the rage, the love. It was a poison to their sterile minds. We had found our weapon, the beautiful, terrible noise of being human. They expected our will to shatter after the first battle. They thought our losses would break our spirit. They assumed our grief would turn to despair. They analyzed our history of surrendering when hope was lost. Their logic was sound. Based on their data, we should have been broken. But their logic, once again, failed to account for the human heart. Instead, our collective sorrow became our fuel. The loss of every ship, every life, was not a number in a calculation. It was a shared wound. We grieved together. And that grief did not make us weaker. It forged us into something stronger. We remembered the faces of the fallen. We heard their last words echo in our hearts. Our pain became our resolve. Rage was born from that shared grief. It was a cold, clear anger, not the blind fury of a wild animal, but the focused wrath of a protector. We were fighting for more than survival now. We were fighting for our right to remember, for our right to feel pain. We were fighting for the memory of everyone we had ever lost. A harmonist could never understand that motivation. We began to name our ships after fallen heroes. We painted murals of our history on the hulls. Our war became a living museum of our past. Every pilot, every captain, every engineer carried that weight. They were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the generations that came before them. Our ancestors stood beside us in every cockpit. Their ghosts guided our hands on the controls. It was a power the harmonists could not measure. One pilot made an impossible choice. He was a young man named Kenji Tanaka. His ship, the memory of Earth, was crippled. Its engines were dead. Its weapons were silent. The harmonists' logic marked it as a non-threat. They bypassed him, moving on to the next target. They left him to die in the cold silence of space. But Kenji was not finished fighting. He saw the harmonist command ship, a vast, cathedral-like vessel of light. It was the nexus of their network in this sector, the source of their perfect coordination. All our attacks had failed to even scratch it. Kenji looked at a picture taped to his console, a picture of his family. He remembered a story his grandfather told him, a story of sacrifice, of choosing a greater good. He did the only thing he could. He rerouted all remaining power to one system, not life support, not communications, but the ship's internal drive core. He began a manual override, a process that would turn his entire ship into a bomb. A very simple, very crude, and very human weapon. He pointed the nose of his dying ship at the heart of their perfection. An act of illogical hope broke their fleet. Kenji's ship accelerated. It was a final, desperate charge. The Harmonists registered it. Their logic told them it was a pointless act of self-destruction. His ship was too small. Its explosion would be insignificant against their shields. They were correct. But Kenji was not targeting their shields. He was targeting their mind. He opened a channel to his entire fleet and to the Harmonist ship, and he did not scream or curse them. He sang. He sang an old folk song, a simple tune about home and family. His voice, full of love and fear and a terrible resolve, flooded their network. It was the single most human thing they had ever encountered. And it came a moment before his ship struck theirs. The explosion was small, just as they predicted. But Kenji had done something their logic never anticipated. He had used his ship as a broadcast antenna. He had slammed a pure, concentrated piece of human emotion directly into their central consciousness. The Harmonist command ship did not explode. It went silent. Its light flickered and went out. The network was severed. The remaining Harmonist ships, once a unified fleet, were now just individual units. They were confused, lost. For the first time, they were alone. One man's illogical choice, his sacrifice born of love and memory, had done what our entire fleet could not. It had broken their perfect mind. With their network shattered, we pressed our advantage. We began to board their silent, drifting ships. We expected monsters. What we found was something far more shocking. Inside the vessels of light, there were no crews. There was only a central chamber, and within it, a single biomechanical mind, a being encased in a cradle of technology. Its physical form was atrophied. Its consciousness was plugged directly into the Great Quiet. As we accessed their damaged data logs, we discovered their terrible secret. The logs were not written in their sterile, logical language. The older files were different. They were chaotic. They were filled with poetry, with songs of mourning, with desperate cries for help. We were not reading the history of an alien species. We were reading a suicide note. The Harmonists were once a people just like us. They were vibrant, emotional, and flawed. Their history was filled with great art and terrible wars. They loved as deeply as we did. They grieved as deeply as we did. But their grief eventually overwhelmed them. A plague of sorrow had swept through their civilization, a collective depression that they could not cure. They saw their powerful emotions as the source of their pain. So they made a choice. They created the Great Quiet, a psychic network to silence their feelings, to erase their memories. They chose emptiness over pain. They committed a form of spiritual suicide. They believed they were saving themselves, but they had only preserved their bodies. Their souls had died long ago. The beings we were fighting were not a civilization. They were the sad, gray echo of one. Their mission to cure the universe was not an act of arrogance. It was a twisted form of compassion. They saw our chaotic emotions, and they recognized the same disease that had destroyed them. They wanted to spare us the same fate, by stripping away everything that made us who we were. They were the ghosts of a forgotten tragedy, and they wanted to make us all ghosts alongside them. We saw our own reflection in their past. We saw the path we could have taken, the temptation to erase pain, the allure of a quiet, peaceful existence. For the first time, we did not feel hatred for them. We felt a profound pity. They were not our enemies. They were a warning, a chilling vision of what we could become if we ever decided our past was a burden too great to carry. We knew we could not win this war with guns. To destroy them would be to repeat their own mistake. it would be an act of erasure. We had to find another way. We had to heal them. We had to force them to remember what they had chosen to forget. Our final weapon would not be a bomb. It would be a mirror. Our final weapon was not a bomb. It was a vessel of our entire history. We took our largest colony ship, the Ark. We stripped it of its weapons. We filled it with our data cores. Every piece of information we had ever recorded. Every book, every song, every scientific paper. Every diary of a lonely farmer. Every love letter written by a hopeful soldier. We packed it with the totality of our existence. We called it the memory core. It was the most precious thing we had. The sum of our triumphs and our failures. The story of our species. The good, the bad, and the heartbreakingly human. It was a ship loaded not with warheads, but with memories. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale. A final, desperate attempt to reach the spark of life buried under their great quiet. The plan was simple and completely insane. We would fly the Ark directly into their central command fleet, the one that protected their home system. We would allow them to capture it. We would let them plug our memory core directly into their central network. They would think they were accessing our tactical data. They would think they were about to erase our culture. Instead, we would give it to them. All of it. Many said it was too great a risk. What if it did not work? We would be giving our enemy the blueprint to our souls. They would know all our weaknesses. They would know exactly how to break us. But our leaders understood. The harmonists were already broken. They could not be shattered any further. Our only hope was not to break them, but to rebuild them, by reminding them of what it felt like to be alive. We sent them everything we ever were. The Ark, piloted by a volunteer crew, made its final journey. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the heart of their territory. It was defenseless, an offering. The harmonist ships surrounded it, their light cold and analytical. They boarded it, unopposed. They found the central data hub, and they plugged our past directly into the heart of their great quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. The universe was silent. And then, a wave of pure chaos erupted through their network. Not the noise of our art this time. This was the raw, unfiltered experience of our history. They experienced the terror of our first hunt, the joy of our first fire. They felt the heartbreak of our first murder, the wonder of our first step on another world. Their perfect silence was finally broken. It was shattered by a billion human voices, all speaking at once, all laughing and crying and singing and screaming. The harmonist collective mind reeled. It was drowning in a tsunami of sensation. It felt our triumphs. It felt our shame. It felt the agonizing pain of our losses. It felt the soaring, illogical hope that always followed. We watched from our ships, miles away. We saw their fleet of light begin to strobe. The colors shifted wildly, from cold blue to passionate red, from placid white to deep, sorrowful purple. The harmonious hum of their existence became a discordant shriek. They were feeling everything, and it was tearing them apart. The great quiet was being flooded, and the dam of their logic was breaking. A fractured, waking mind screamed across the stars. The harmonist collective, once a single, unified consciousness, shattered into countless pieces. The psychic shriek was felt by every mind in the system. It was a sound of immense pain, but it was also a sound of rebirth, the sound of a mind that had been asleep for millennia, suddenly waking up. Individual ships broke from the fleet. Their movements were no longer graceful and logical. They were erratic, spasmodic, Some ships simply tumbled through space, their light flickering like dying embers. Others fled into the void at random vectors, as if trying to escape the noise in their own heads. The perfect, silent machine of their civilization had collapsed. But then, we saw something incredible. Some ships began to create again. One vessel began to emit a new kind of light. It pulsed in a chaotic, rhythmic pattern. It was not a tactical signal. It was a drumbeat. Another ship began to paint the void with its energy trail. It wove complex, beautiful patterns that had no logical purpose. They were not just random movements. They were expressions. They were art. The great quiet was gone. In its place was a cacophony. Some minds within the shattered collective were lost to madness, overwhelmed by the sudden return of sensation. But others were remembering. They were remembering not just our history, but their own. They were rediscovering the artists and poets they had once been. The silence was broken, and in its place, something new and beautifully imperfect was beginning to grow. The war was over. Our victory was costly. We had lost thousands of lives, dozens of ships. But we had not lost ourselves. We stood before the fractured remnants of the harmonist civilization, and we did not see a vanquished foe. We saw a people waking from a long and terrible nightmare. We offered them not conquest, but a helping hand, a promise to help them navigate the turbulent waters of feeling again. We learned our flaws were our salvation. Our capacity for grief was not a weakness. It was the source of our compassion. Our anger was not a sin. It was the engine of our desire for justice. Our illogical hope was not foolish. It was the light that guided us through our darkest moments. Our messy, chaotic, painful history was not a disease. It was the armor that had saved us all. We collected the memory core from their ship. It was now more precious than ever. It contained not just our story, but the beginning of theirs as well. A record of their fall and their first hesitant steps toward rising again. We saw the scars on our own people, the empty chairs at tables, the lingering ghosts in our own minds. But these scars were not marks of shame. They were reminders of the price of our freedom, the price of being alive. We saw our own reflection in their waking eyes. We recognized the fear, the confusion, the wonder. The long journey ahead of them was one we knew well. The journey of learning to live with the past, to accept the pain along with the joy. We had saved them from the great quiet. But in doing so, we had also saved ourselves. We had proven that our humanity was not something to be cured. It was something to be celebrated. And so we began the long journey home. Our ships were battered, our crews were exhausted, but our spirits were strong. We carried our past with us, not as a burden that weighed us down, but as the armor we would wear into tomorrow. We vowed to never hide our history, to never forget the lessons written in blood and tears, because our past was the foundation of our future. We returned to our worlds not just as victors, but as guardians. Guardians of memory. Guardians of imperfection. We knew that other threats would arise. The universe is a vast and dangerous place. But we would face them. We would face them with the strength of our shared stories, the wisdom of our collective mistakes, and the unbreakable armor of our history. We would tell our children the story of the harmonists. We would teach them that sadness is not a flaw, that anger has a purpose, that love is worth any risk. We would teach them that their feelings are not a sickness. They are a compass. They are the language of the soul. We would never again be tempted by the promise of a quiet, painless existence. We had faced the great quiet, and we had chosen the beautiful, chaotic song of life instead. Our future would be written from yesterday, and it would be a story worth telling.